morning. Welcome everyone to the Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. We are here today for our second session with Patricia Farnese. She will be presenting on the regulatory framework underlying wetland drainage in Saskatchewan using a case study using the Quill Lakes and Peatland harvesting. So before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to just take a moment and acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan, including Treaty Number 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Dene people. Saskatchewan is also the traditional home of the Métis Nation. And I would like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked this land for centuries. This conference is brought to you by the Citizens Environmental Alliance and many like-minded organizations. Our goal through this conference is to increase awareness around the issue of farmland drainage, bringing together backgrounds, a wide range of backgrounds, including farmers, environmentalists, Indigenous people, academic, and local governments, to create a holistic discussion around the issue. Just a few housekeeping notes. For this presentation, your mics will be on mute, and we will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So you can go ahead and type them out in the chat box as we go along, and we'll have a question period at the end of the presentation where I'll moderate the questions with Patricia. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to present our speakers today. So Patricia Farnese is a lawyer and law professor at the University of Saskatchewan. In addition to her undergraduate degrees, Patricia holds a Master's of Law degree in agricultural law. Her published research critiques both the design and implementation of agri-environmental policies, including policies intended to promote the wise use of wetlands. Patricia is internationally recognized for her wetlands research and has been invited to share her expertise with lawyers, land managers, wetland scientists, and policymakers in both Canada and abroad. Recently, she was invited by the Organization of American States to meet with chief judges in many Latin American Supreme Courts to discuss how to better ensure effective implementation and enforcement of wetland regulations. She has also attended and as an invited expert, meetings of the Ramsar Convention and International Agreement on Wetlands. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Patricia.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm not sure where all of you are from, but I am a professor, and so this is my first time in a long time doing something other than teaching and preparing to be online. So it's great to get back into the research that I'm doing. I'm just going to confirm that you can all see my screen is working well and you can see my presentation. Is that right?
Yes, Patricia, I can see your presentation and you are good to go.
Okay, perfect. Well, my goal here today is to look at these two wetland areas as case studies on what's happening with peatland harvesting and sort of what's happened in the Quill Lakes. I think many of you are likely more familiar with the controversy or conflict around the Quill Lakes, so I don't know that I need to do a lot of background on that, but that's just sort of the model and the framework that I want you to have in the back of your mind. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to go over generally the agricultural drainage approach. And so what I mean by that is when wetlands are on agricultural land, the regulatory framework that structures drainage that occurs on that. I'm going to compare that with peatland drainage, which is regulated somewhat under the Crown Resources Land Regulations when that occurs from Crown land. I'm going to talk about environmental assessments because that comes up as an expectation sometimes as to what should be done when we're talking about wetland drainage. And then I'm going to provide you with some of my comments or reflections on the two approaches that we have in Saskatchewan to regulate these two distinct, two types of wetlands, right? So peatlands are our form of wetland. They're recognized by the Ramsar Convention and by our national Ramsar and federal sort of responses to that peatlands are part of a wetland structure, and so many of the expectations that you would have in terms of what wetland should become, how wetland should be conserved, would also apply to peatlands. So I also want to just say that I keep this in the back of my mind because I know that the Water Security Agency began consulting stakeholders on conservation policy in an attempt to balance the need for some drainage to occur with the need to preserve wetland benefits. I think that that's primarily been considered in the context of agricultural drainage, but I would hope that when we do adopt a new wetland conservation policy, that we think broadly about that and protect not just the agricultural drainage, but also the drainage from other areas, including peatlands. So I'm sure many of you have seen this photo before. It's been all over the media. That is flooding that's come in Saskatchewan as a result of the Quill Lakes spilling over. This rail line is under threat, obviously, by high water levels, or can be under threat depending on the season, and record levels of precipitation, as well as upstream drainage. Some of it lawful in that it was regulated and permitted, but much of it unlawful, has resulted in significant amounts of flooding of the adjacent lands. And those lands have included wildlife habitat, but what's really drawn attention is the privately owned farmland that has been lost. And as the waters retreat, there's concerns, because the Quill Lakes are saline, that the lands may take a significant amount of time to recover because of the increased saline content on those lands. They're also important nesting grounds for migratory shorebirds, and investments made by local communities surrounding the Quill Lakes to build the infrastructure to attract people who are bird watchers or who would want to recreate in natural areas have all but been destroyed as a result of this flooding. And so this really has been a focal point of drainage concerns, and precipitated this and likely a report from the auditor, provincial auditor, commenting on the government's inability or failure to get a hold of unregulated drainage in 2015, has really produced a new approach, or some modifications to the drainage regime that we have in the province since 2015. And I call it a drainage regime because that's what it is. The focus has been and always been in regulating drainage. It's not been in Saskatchewan conserving wetlands. That's a factor and a consideration that is spoken about, but the regime that's been built upon was really about promoting and facilitating drainage with having as little impacts as possible to downstream landowners. The goal of conserving wetlands really is more of a modern goal, I would say, and one that's not been particularly picked up in the Saskatchewan regulatory framework. And so if you've heard me before, I've certainly presented to this group in the past, and have done the rounds, I think, in Saskatchewan. So you may all be familiar with a lot of this, but as I said, there's no prohibition although this reference is gone. Historically, you weren't required to have a drainage permit if the water didn't leave your property. And so you could do things called slough consolidation. And on the prairies, in the prairie pothole region, that's certainly what we saw. We saw little isolated, well, perceived isolated wetlands being joined into larger water bodies, and those have ecological effects. And as landowners, because the sizes of farms become greater, the ability to move a significant amount of water from one area to another greatly increases, because now we have landowners with significant amounts of property holders. So that's not to say, you know, you are required, and that sort of out, I would say, or exception is not as promoted as it was in the past, as a real clear exception of when you don't need to have a permit. But we see that still being influenced and an expectation of acceptable drainage in the province. What's changed since 2015 is this agricultural drainage approach, this new approach, which is promoting multiple landowners to come together and develop drainage networks across large areas through something called conservation and development areas. I'll talk in more detail about that. In the past, we did have some grandfathering of historic unpermitted drainage, but that isn't permitted anymore. Any drainage that was done without a permit is unlawful and is subject to consequences, you know, regulatory consequences, having to potentially pay to close, you know, orders, be subject to orders to close those things, and potential regulatory offenses for being in non-compliance of the act. And that removal of the historic unpermitted, you know, sort of grandfathering in of really old drainage works is somewhat of the stick to have landowners participate in large multi-landowner drainage projects, to regularize, to you know, become lawful the drainage work that's happened, because part of the trade-off of participating in this conservation and development areas is the ability of the government to approve what would have been historic unpermitted drainage. And so by participating in this project, we can look at the drainage over a large area, decide what is acceptable within this area, and bring along or regularize this historic unpermitted drainage. And you know, 80 to 90%, some estimates are, of the drainage in the province has been done unlawfully without a permit. That's a significant amount of non-compliance with the regulations. It's more than you know, really most types of regulatory non-compliance. I think more people are honest on their taxes than are in terms of getting a permit. So it's a significant amount of drainage that has occurred unlawfully in the past. And so the attempts to encourage people in a you know, a non-enforcement kind of way by giving them this incentive to regularize their drainage has been sort of the focus of the water agency in the last 5 years or so. When determining whether or not a drainage project should be approved, particularly these, you know, drainage works, but you know, should be considered in the larger drainage works, the regulations don't provide a lot of detail about what's met or required, but it does. There is an expectation that properties' hydrology, the water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and any downstream impacts be mitigated before approval is given. So that's what, when you're putting together your drainage proposal, that's what the minister is looking for. There is a complaint process. The minute that has been revised in the last number of years since those changes occurred. And what that is you can ask for an investigation by the ministry if you feel like you are being impacted by a drainage work. There's also civil liability. So this is new. There wasn't a direct cause of action. There was a requirement to go through an administrative tribunal before you could get to court, and we found a huge amount of delays in that process, particularly because it required the provincial government to issue a finding before you could access the administrative tribunal process, the board to make a decision as to whether or not the drainage that was happening was causing you harm and whether you should have a remedy for that. And you couldn't get into court until you went through that process. And so even if you were being flooded out every year and you knew it was coming, you couldn't get into court to get that addressed because there was this step that you would have to take. And that was a significant barrier to getting these matters addressed. And so one of the big changes has been this idea that you can go directly to court now if you are harmed or believe that you are being harmed by unpermitted drainage. Then you can make an application to court for a remedy, and that could be an injunction, it could be damages if you are feeling financial consequences as a result of that. So I'm going to talk briefly about this conservation and development area drainage work process. Now there's an act that specifically applies to the conservation development areas, how you set them up. And so there's lots of steps in terms of how you set it up. But the main component about this is, or the changes that allows neighbors to avoid individual approvals for drainage works. They come together as one and apply for a network of drainage rather than each individual drain on each individual landowner's property. But what it also does is it allows neighbors to force the participation of other neighbors if a significant amount of, I think it's about 80% of neighbors agree to participate, then land can be expropriated and landowners who don't want to be participated can be forced to participate. And so that's sort of how a conservation and development area works. What I want to focus on though is how we get these drainage works approved and what happens, what considerations do these processes take into, what environmental considerations do these processes take into place. And so these steps that I'm going to put forward are not regulations per se. They are the guidelines, so they're non-binding, but they're the guidelines that the government promotes as what you should be doing if you wish to get approval for one of these drainage networks. And so the first one is this sort of broad conceptual report, the first step, and that's where you look at technical feasibility and economic feasibility, and it's really comparing, what options are available to us, where can we put this drainage network, what are the costs, what are our options. And so it's really, really high level. That's the first thing you do, and that's the report that the group of neighbors who want to do this will shop around among their neighbors to get that buy-in for setting up. If the conservation and development area isn't set up yet, setting up that area, but getting participation and agreement to go down the route of putting together this drainage network. The next thing you would do at one of these C&D areas would do is they would, still at a very high level, determine whether the project is reasonable and practicable. And so that'll involve some field work, might identify some real areas that would ramp the costs up so significantly that it wouldn't be able to make it economically viable. And so again, the focus here is the cost worth the benefit? And there's not a lot of language in the proposed approach that speaks to how you assess the benefit other than in terms of land being recovered so that it's able to be brought into production versus the cost of putting the infrastructure in. So how much water can you move? What's the cost of moving that water? What do you gain in terms of arable land in order to justify this expense? It's only, well, I should go back there. At this point also, you're going to have to get some professional help, some people who can really do the assessment of the hydrology and some of the impacts to the wildlife potentially and downstream neighbors. It's not something that an individual can put together without a qualified, being a qualified person, somebody with the training and skills. And so at this stage, you're also going to identify the engineer who's going to do that work for you. And so finally, you'll get this detailed design, and this is what's submitted to the minister for approval. And this is just sort of, this process doesn't escape or avoid what anybody would have to do. If I have one piece of land and I want to do some drainage work on it, I'm going to have to make a proposal to the Minister of Environment to get approval. What's going to be expected on my tiny little section of land with my little culvert or something that I want to put in is going to be a detailed plan in terms of this is where I'm going, this is the water I'm moving, this is where I'm going to put the culvert, right? This is the size. The expectation isn't going to be, given the scope of the project, as big and as what would be for this. But it's the same process ultimately at the end to go through the approval. You need a permit to conduct a drainage work, and it's that authority that has the C&D area has to go through to get. They have to get that permit. And so this report will look at the hydrology. It'll have to do a detailed site investigation that will survey the land. It will be specific in terms of the culverts. It'll be detailed in terms of what kind of water control structures will be there. It will ask about erosion control, and that's really speaking to water quality and any, they have this vague conversation or vague sort of thing, satisfy any regulatory requirements. And that's, known things like if you need a permit, a highways permit, if you need some permits through a municipality that might have some bylaws or things that are required. If you are getting close to a water course, something that comes from the environment, that's generally, you do need to be in compliance. You need to show that you are meeting those requirements. But there's not a lot of specific detail about what level of protection is required. How you decide what wetlands, there's no direction on how you decide what wetlands, if any, should be protected in that conservation part. There's no guidelines that are provided in that sense. So what's missing from that framework then, both if you're a C&D, which really is a bigger project, maybe the consequences of these things missing are greater, but what's missing then is there's no mitigation sequence, and that's something that you would find in our neighbors on either side of us, Alberta and Manitoba. That's where when deciding to have an impact to drain or doing any kind of work that will have an impact on the wetland, the first thing you need to do is avoid draining wetlands the best you can. If you can't avoid, then you need to mitigate that drainage and reduce the impacts of what you're going to have if avoidance can't be achieved. And then if you do have to drain a wetland, then those wetland values, those benefits that we get from wetlands, the needs to be compensated. And so you're not allowed to just get rid of wetlands. There has to be this balance between conservation and drainage. Again, we have no direction in the province in terms of what wetlands are off limits. Are there wetlands? There may be specific things internal to the government when they're making their assessments, when the people inside the walls of government are looking at approvals. They may have have made some policy decisions about certain wetlands being significant and having enough drainage, and they're not going to permit anymore. But there's really no public assessment of wetlands of critically or high value that we're just going to say are off limits. There's no measurable wetland conservation target or goal in our province, and so some places have a goal as no net loss of wetlands, or a percentage of really, in Saskatchewan we might not be that we want to protect 70% of historic wetlands that have been here or something to that. So this is an important factor to take into consideration as each project looked at somewhat in isolation. There is a goal to look at cumulative effects, but without a target or a goal, those are really being considered somewhat in a vacuum. There's no ongoing monitoring or reporting requirements, and that I will speak to. This is a comparison with the peatland harvesting, where there are those things. Once you get your drainage work, provided that you're not making any significant modifications, you can have it forever as well. And there's no obligation to report how much water is moving, if there's been a change, for instance, due to, maybe there's suddenly a lot more upstream water draining onto this project, and now there's a lot more water moving and it changes the impacts downstream. None of that is required. Certainly the minister is allowed in a permit to permit or to require that in their permitting process, but nothing is required, and I don't know if it's been required in the permits that have been approved so far. I'm not aware of that anyway. There's no mechanism for broad public consultation in the approval process. Yes, there's the obligation to provide notice that this is happening, and there's some short time frames for people who see this notice to write in, and if they are feeling like that they will be harmed or damaged, they have the right to provide comments to the minister before they approve, and the minister can take those into considerations if they choose, but there's no obligation on the proponent to really go out and do consultation to see what the concerns might be for these projects. There's no criteria for approval. The minister has really broad discretion. They have to take into consideration those factors that I talked about in the past, hydrology, impacts on downstream landowners, but there is no sort of minimum levels of criteria that have to be met. It's really broad discretion for the minister to approve or not after considering those factors. And so it's really that balance between do we go ahead or not is somewhat of a black box, and it's hard to assess the reasonableness of those decisions when there's no criteria in which a minister has to say it meets these sets of criteria. And very rarely, if ever, I'm not sure, are these drainage work projects subject to an environmental impact assessment. So I want to talk now about peat harvesting, and I'm not so familiar. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with peat harvesting. I know that we're mainly talking about agricultural lands in this context, but Saskatchewan has approximately 4.9 million hectares of peatland, according to Stats Canada. So we consider 4.9 million hectares of peatland. There was 14.8 million hectares of cropland seeded infield crops in 2016. So it's not in terms of agricultural lands in comparison to the agricultural land base of Saskatchewan, it's not as significant, but it's still a lot of land. And the process for harvesting peat is quite interesting. So this is the machine that they're using. It's essentially a big vacuum, and it begins by constructing main and subsidiary access roads, the installation of drainage networks, because peat does have to get drained and dried to a certain level before it's harvested. The top layer is cleared and mulched and graded, and then as I say, once this is done, the drainage is allowed to happen, and it's the land sits for a bit until it gets that surface layer to the moisture content that they wish to have, and then these vacuum trucks come in and pull up the peat and transport it to an area where it's usually like a staging area, storage area, where it's prepared for transport. Once it's harvested, maintenance is required during that harvesting process to ensure that ditches remain and sedimentation ponds are kept clear so that the water can move where it's supposed to move. They continually reshape and grade fields. And then ultimately the goal is to reclaim. And so if it was forested, to replace it with forest land. If it needs to be more wet, to re-wet that land. The ability and the success of that is improving all the time, but it remains, it takes a very long time to develop peat resources. And so we're working towards that. But there's huge potential for growth in peat harvesting in Saskatchewan. 3/4 of all production is in the eastern provinces, while Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta account for about 25% of the peat harvesting. Most of this peat is going towards horticultural production and mushroom growing. But of the 25% that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba amounts to, only 3% of that is Saskatchewan. And you can see that, in comparison, this is just a peat distribution in Canada. When you look at Alberta and Manitoba, we do have significant amount of peat resources, and they're not as developed as they are at our two neighbors. And increasingly, we're seeing proposals coming forward to expand our peat production to put us on par. There is an industry group or an association that somewhat regulates the total production to ensure that it's sustainable. And Saskatchewan's one of those areas that have been identified as potential for growth. And so I want to compare this because it is a wetland that is being drained, and I want to talk about the approval process for doing this. And so interestingly, in the last number of years, and I don't have the history on that, it's something that I think if anybody knows, I'd be happy to hear, but in the last number of years, peat was regulated as a forest product, a non-timber forest product. And now it's been moved out of the Forest Products Act and is regulated under the Crown Lands Act. I'm sorry, I don't have the name, escapes me right at the exact moment. And so most of the regulation targeting peat is for peat that's being regulated on Crown land. Presumably, that means that there are no regulations on harvesting peat on land that is owned by individuals, subject to the fact that if you're draining it, it's still a wetland that's draining, and there's no reason why the rules shouldn't apply for having to have a drainage work. But there's significant problems, and we've seen that our ability to regulate private drainage is difficult on agricultural lands. There's no reason to suggest that it would be any easier on peatlands. And so we know on private land, particularly as climate change is allowing us to farm and move land up further north, that much of the peat, not much of the peat, but there's increasing amounts of private land peat that has peat underneath it being cleared, burned, and converted to ag lands. And it's really not being regulated. You may have to have a permit for burning in a certain municipality and those types of things, but there's not really a lot of oversight in terms of, or even measurement as to how much of this is occurring, but we do know that it is in fact occurring. And so, as I said, most of this is regulated as a Crown resource. It uses systems like permits and licenses. Maximum 33 years can one of these be issued. You can't use peat for fuel, which is an interesting protection in our regulation. Certainly other jurisdictions like Ireland, which has probably the most extensive peat regulations, had to really step up the sustainability of the peat harvest because that's what they were using it for. And so you go through peat pretty quick if you're using it as fuel. Any person who holds a permit or license has to report every year what has been taken and what is proposed for the upcoming year. Even though they have permission over the time of their lease to harvest, there's ongoing monitoring that has to happen. And often, given the nature of these projects, and I did speak to the extent of how we set those up, they are subject to environmental assessment. Again, we don't really have a true mitigation sequence, but in the environmental assessment process, if these projects go through them, there is an obligation to decommission these projects and restore the lands as part of the proposal that goes forward, putting forward your proposal of how that will occur. We have no off-limits peatlands. Again, just like we don't have with the wetlands that find on agricultural lands, we haven't done a comprehensive study of wetlands of significance or importance and decided which ones need to stay and not be subject to development in any kind of way, because we don't have this measurable wetland conservation target and goal that generally in the province. We also don't have it for the peatlands. And you know, the peat industry is just taking off in the province. There's been some peat development always, you know, the last 30 years or so in Saskatchewan, but there's really this potential and expansion of the growth right now, and this is the time to think about that so that we don't get ourselves into the situation that we have with unregulated, uncontrolled drainage as we do in the south, right? It's easier to deal up front than try to put the horse back in the barn or whatever that expression is. As I mentioned, if they don't go through the environmental impact assessment, there's no criteria again for approval. It is up to ministerial discretion. And so these permits can be given if it's in the public interest to do so. Again, no broad consultation if it's not going through the EIA process. And there isn't in this case a complaint process at all. So you would have to, if you know you're being harmed by a peatland harvesting the drainage that's coming from them, if it's unregulated, you could go through. If it's drainage, you could go through the, you know, you can rely on that section that allows for civil liability under the Sask Water Agency Act. Otherwise, you'd just be going to court and trying to prove that they are causing a nuisance or they're trespassing on your land, or find some other legal mechanism to go forward. So let's just talk a little bit about environmental impact assessment. The trigger for an environmental impact assessment is that a project is a development. And that's not just a Saskatchewan invention. That's pretty much all environmental impact assessment legislation regimes require that sort of trigger. It has to be a significant enough project that would require an environmental impact assessment. And significance is it's not a very specific term. It's pretty qualitative and imprecise, but we do have some criteria. If it has an effect on a unique, rare, or endangered feature of the environment, that's something that would trigger it. And if we were to designate certain wetlands as being of importance, for instance, that might be one way that we would know that environmental impact assessment should happen. You know, if it causes emissions or waste products, if there's huge concerns about it, if there's some new technology that might have an environmental impact that we're not comfortable with, or it has this, you know, there's this general catch-all significant environmental impact. The challenge, you know, it's great. I talked about not having criteria in the past, but the challenge with this use of words like significant and substantial is that they're imprecise, and different people can have different views on the thresholds for what makes something significant and what makes something substantial. And what we see is an expectation often from the public to, or conflict, I should say, in the public views of what that's significant and what is substantial. And they reach different conclusions based on their own subjective views of what these terms mean, and that can cause conflict. The public isn't as likely to go to case law or past practice to help shape what these words mean, which certainly we do if we challenge a decision in court that a project isn't a development. Courts will look to what other things have been considered developments in the past and what makes something significant. So these words aren't entirely unuseful, but I think from a pragmatic public perspective, you see the impreciseness of these words really creating some conflict. So the first thing that happens if you're going to do an environmental assessment is you do a self-assessment, right? There's some tools that the Saskatchewan government gives you to look at the impacts of your process and to decide whether or not you think that your project needs to go through the EIA process. Interestingly, with some of these peatland projects, we're seeing the proponents saying right off the bat that, yes, this is a significant project, they'll have significant impacts, and it is a development for the purposes of the environmental impact assessment, and so they voluntarily submit their proposal to that process. You may have recently heard in the news the project outside of La Ronge that is getting a lot of attention because there's concerns of the impact on that project, particularly to trappers and hunters and people who recreate in that area. That project, the proponent of that project self-assessed that an environmental assessment was necessary. There's some reasons other than it's not having those adverse impacts, right? If the impacts aren't significant, it's not too big of a project. But also, if the project is highly regulated by another industry or another regulatory authority, I should say, then they may not need an environmental assessment. So if we were going to put in, I don't know, a nuclear reactor, for instance, that's a very regulated industry. It's going to have to go through a significant amount of regulatory approvals under the federal scheme for environmental assessment. And so you may not see that our provincial legislation would be triggered as well. Likewise, if the mitigation measures that are put forward clearly demonstrate that there's no risk as a result of this, or it's very minimized, and a project may be pulled out that otherwise would be a development. So once you do that self-assessment, you have to put together your technical proposal. And that proposal defines the environmental impacts and what you plan to do to avoid those impacts. So unlike the C&D proposal that's going forward for the drainage works, where environment is mentioned, but the balance is really about the economic wisdom of putting forward this project. Here in an environmental assessment, the project is really looking and has at the forefront identifying what environmental consequences are and then attempting to mitigate them, or avoid them, or mitigating them. And there's detailed requirements of what's supposed to go into this proposal. And I'm looking at the time. I'm going to just wrap up in 3 minutes probably. These requirements are very detailed of what's expected. There is some economic consideration. The description of the environment includes socioeconomic considerations, but it has looking at the project not just while it's working and while it's being created and being implemented, but what's going to happen throughout it, the monitoring that you're going to do, the decommissioning, and then there's specific requirements of consultation with the public, as well as with consultations with First Nations and Métis communities. And again, you have to go back to all proving that these things that make it a development are being addressed in your plan. So I just want to wrap up with some reflections on these approaches. And the first is the idea that resource designation matters. When you're comparing what's happening with peatlands versus what's happening with wetlands on agricultural lands, you see a distinction. The resource is peat, and it's being regulated like a resource, like oil and gas, like hard rock minerals, like forest products. It's something that in and of itself has a value as an economic resource, as a which is different than what's happening in the prairie context, in the agricultural land context. The water isn't seen as a resource in a real sense. There's no industry group advocating for ensuring that we have access over the long term for those for that water resource. The resource that's being dealt with is actually the agricultural land, and so that's likely why you're seeing more attention to ensuring the sustainability and the long-term protection, that which exists at all, of the peatlands. The other thing to reflect on is the fact that history matters. We haven't had the unregulated drainage of the peatlands like we've had in the south, and so we're able to implement more effective regulations with the experience that we've had in the south. But as I said, we're still doing it without an overall vision of what the balance is. How much peatlands do we want to have exploited in the province? To a certain extent, the fact that it's a resource and the industry is interested in ensuring a long-term viable, sustainable industry. They're somewhat filling the gap in terms of promoting targets and caps on production, but that's dependent on the goodwill of those producers willing to do that. Approval criteria matter. I mentioned that briefly, to the extent that when government is given broad discretion to do what they wish, to make a decision to approve or not approve, without criteria, especially in the absence of independent assessment, which means they don't have to take the words of experts or a panel of people who are brought together to look at these things, that they are an internal decision. It's very hard to say that the decision wasn't appropriate. The government has to strike a balance. They have to put together competing interests. That's why they're there. That's what they're taught to do. And as long as they're not being arbitrary or unfair to one party or another in that process, it's hard to criticize without something in the legislation that says the factors that should be considered and when approval is allowed and when approval is not allowed. I've talked about this a lot, that wetland conservation goals matter. We don't have that overarching framework that we need. We don't have any clear plans for identifying those wetlands that we should keep. And overall, the cumulative drainage that we will allow. And so without that overarching goal, when we have that, when we try to take into consideration cumulative effects, we don't know when too much drainage has occurred. We haven't, each project can continue to be looked in isolation because there isn't this overarching. We've now dropped below the 70% target or the 60% target or whatever that target is. We have nothing to measure that by. And finally, I want to just say that politics matter, and perhaps I should have written economics matter. Political will is in this province is lacking to tip the balance away from economic growth and development to conservation. We currently have a debate in this province over the appropriate balance between human health and economics. And if human health isn't going to trump economics, conservation probably won't have much success. And I say that as a nonpartisan comment. This is not a problem of the current government. This has been a long-standing problem. Our drainage problem in agricultural lands has occurred under every stripe of government, and we really haven't seen those ideas of putting wetland conservation goals into practice in real ways. And so that is something to consider as we reflect on these approaches. So I think that's my 45 minutes. I'm happy to take comments. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you so much, Patricia. Yes, we do have questions, and if you haven't had a chance to type in your questions, go for it. You can do that now. I have it's a question and a comment here from Oralee. So she just says, thank you for the presentation. One solution put forward by farmers in the Quill Lakes Basin is the 5-acre plan. This is basically farmers would self-regulate and stop and close all 5-acre wetlands in the Quill Lakes. So downstream of this area, they are pretty frustrated that notice has been done and that we see that the 5-acre plan is set to start here. So she just wanted to hear your thoughts and if you had any comments on the 5-acre plan.
I'm not 100% specific on that plan. What I do know, some conservation is better than no conservation, but what that doesn't do is identify which wetlands may be more important than others, right? It's allowing for size to be the matter that is taken into consideration. It doesn't necessarily speak to, the impacts down below. We need wetlands of all different sizes. We need wetlands that dry out, and so those are going to be smaller wetlands. That's what our network requires, and so it's better than nothing, I can say, but without specifics, I'm not sure that I can give you more advice than that. It's likely, yeah, I guess that's all I'll say.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Please finish your thought.
No, that's good. No, that's fine.
All right, our next question is put rather simply, and it's just, do farmers have the right to drain?
They have the right to drain. That's a hard answer, right? For me to say. From a legal perspective, they have they have no right to cause impacts downstream. And so if you can drain without causing impacts off of your property, then from a legal perspective, provided that you're not using a drainage work, you can drain. And so as a landowner, you have an obligation to take any water that naturally comes on your property in a that's running over the surface, that's not in a defined course. I have an obligation to take it. And so if you're upstream and a whole bunch of people are draining on you and you just let it keep flowing by, you have no obligation to your landowner to stop it if it's just draining by. Where you get into trouble is if you start ditching it. And then if you start ditching it, that's considered a drainage work, and you need a permit to operate the drainage work. So the drainage isn't illegal, it's operating the drainage work.
Okay, thank you. Our next
people
question
get in trouble
is regarding...
Can I just say one more thing? Where people get in trouble
Absolutely.
is they think that they can block water coming onto their property, and you can't. If it's in its natural course and there's a whole bunch of water coming, you have an obligation to take it at common law. And so, you know, if people are putting sandbags up to prevent their house from being flooded, I don't think anybody is going to be concerned about that. But what you sometimes see people doing is trying to regrade land, to redirect. All of that can be seen somewhat as a drainage work, but it's also interfering with that obligation that you have to take water coming flowing in its natural course towards you.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is regarding peatland projects, and it is this. Does the peatland project environmental impact assessment process follow the formal process, including approval under the EAA Act, or the EA Act?
Yes, it does. So provided that it meets that requirement for the development, then it's going to go through the environmental impact assessment process under the provincial legislation and gets approval through that process. And so there's, some criticisms that exist about that process, for sure. It's not the perfect process and not everybody is happy with it, but there are some things in that process that isn't present in the agricultural drainage process that we see. And that's, one of that is that regular reporting that's going to happen, the requirements for public engagement and public consultation and real consultation with Indigenous and Métis folks, and that sort of at the core addressing knowing what they are, identifying what they are, and addressing the environmental impacts, both pre-planning, planning, and at the end of decommissioning of any kind of project.
All right. Our next question is, have you been able to find any specific regulations or mechanisms to monitor the effect on groundwater hydrology by drainage projects? So incorporating groundwater into the regulatory framework.
No. So there are regulations for groundwater, and you cannot take groundwater for anything other than domestic purposes without approvals. But we regulate the two regimes, surface water and groundwater, completely differently in separation. And so unless you're almost putting a pipe in the ground and tapping into that groundwater resource, that the recharge component isn't considered in the groundwater regime, and it's not considered in the surface water regime, the impacts on groundwater recharge, because we regulate the two waters separately. It's a gap.
All right, thank you. Our next question here is around the Indigenous rights. So how will Canada's adoption of UNDRIP, which this is the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, affect provincial regulations? So there's a comment here, so which currently lack a consultation phase unless an environmental impact here is triggered. So how would both provincial regulations and UNDRIP at the federal level merge together here, work together?
Okay, so first of all, even if it's not through the EIA process, if you have the potential to impact treaty or Aboriginal rights, there's an obligation to consult with Indigenous peoples in Canada. That's an obligation that comes out of Section 35, and that exists. What people don't realize is that, if it's not triggered, if it's not pointed to, people don't think they have to do that. So there is still that obligation, but you don't have to demonstrate. It's not clearly specified how you did that in the process for the agricultural drainage. And UNDRIP isn't really saying anything or that our Supreme Court hasn't already said. Our Supreme Court has said that Canada has to reconcile our land use and our rules and regulations, the fact that we weren't here first, and there are pre-existing Indigenous communities that were here before us, continue to be here, and their rights pre-exist ours, and we need to reconcile those two together. And part of that recognition is a recognition of, or the relationship between sovereignty and Indigenous rights. So we have this great language in our Supreme Court telling us that these are things that we have to do. We have not figured out how to do it. And so what that actually means, it's anybody's guess at this point. We're doing some consultation, and we've got some ideas about what consultation is, meaningful consultation. Some people talk about prior informed consent. We haven't had that idea from UNDRIP incorporated directly into our law, but there's certainly capacity for that to already have been recognized, and increasing pressure that is what Indigenous recognition and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples mean. And so I don't think we should be concerned about UNDRIP, because I don't think it creates any new obligations that our courts haven't already recognized. We're still figuring it out, though, what that impact is going to be. And it's anybody's guess, because we've only been doing it for the last 20 years and we haven't got it right yet.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time. I'll take one last question here. This is about the measurable wetland conservation goal that you mentioned missing from the current framework. Do you have any suggestions or any particular models that you think currently work well between balancing a landscape approach where wetland drainage is considered within the larger framework of a landscape where there are multiple wetlands, compared to drainage approvals for individual wetlands? So essentially, if there's a framework that compares how we approve one wetland on an individual basis compared to in relation to each other.
Yeah, I'm definitely more in support of a landscape approach, because a landscape approach allows you to do those before a project comes forward, allows you to identify the network of wetlands that you need to keep and that are important, that need to be mitigated if they are, it doesn't necessarily mean that a wetland will never be impacted or maybe even destroyed, filled, for instance, but that needs to be compensated if, in fact, we do lose that wetland through a development decision. And so that's the approach that I think will happen. I think it will involve identifying, which we still don't have a very good map, complete map of what the wetlands are in Saskatchewan, where they are, what functions they're doing. This is a requirement that we've had for a long time under the Ramsar Convention. We were supposed to do this. Many jurisdictions have. Canada has a lot more wetlands, and Saskatchewan has a lot of wetlands. I understand that. But that's the approach that we should be doing. And from there, you would take a decision as to what, you'd be looking at what the historic wetlands are, how many have been lost, and what functions are they continuing or should be functions they should be functioning or providing functions they should be providing in the landscape, and then match the target to that. And that, is, I think, the ideal model on the case-by-case basis. Again, you can't adequately do a cumulative effect analysis if you don't have that overarching vision and goal, because what is too much then, right? How many impacts are too much? We don't know. It also means that proponents, if we get to a point where we're at a critical stage, it means the people who get there first get to drain, and the people who get there last don't get to. And that doesn't seem to me to be fair in any kind of way. The reasons and the need, the economic needs, the pressures that the farmers who got there first needed to drain are going to be just the same as the farmers who got there last. But the farmers who got there last, maybe because water flows and it's reaching them at the very end, I'll have to bear that entire cost, and that's not appropriate. The other thing that I would think the landscape does is it corrects, I think, again, the people who haven't drained yet, the historic drainage. It may require some of the people who've benefited from unpermitted drainage to take some responsibility and re-put some back in, so that the people who have followed the rules or have been downstream and have been affected first aren't stuck dealing with this. You know, the landowners around Quill Lakes, you know, I'm sure there's some of them that have drained a wetland or done something, you know, but they're not responsible for all that water. That's a network of water that's come from a whole bunch of landowners who have been able to pass those costs down. If you're doing it on a cumulative effect, we can take a look at that and share the burdens and responsibilities across the landscape. And then also, I think, justify compensation and investment, because those of us who aren't landowners but who benefit from those wetland functions could contribute to the costs of keeping that water on the landscape. That was a long answer. Hope it answers what they wanted.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you so much for this whole presentation. It's been very informative. All right, let's just wrap up here. Thank you for the ongoing discussion, folks. We just want to say thank you to Patricia for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
All right, and if you are interested in staying tuned for our following presentations, you can register at the link provided there at sierraclub.ca. If you'd like some more background on the issue of farmland drainage and the Roundtable Initiative, so kind of the precursor events that has led to this conference, you can look at the Incentrix report, and that's housed on the Saskatchewan Environmental Society website under Issues in Water. And a recording of this presentation will be available on the Citizens Environmental Alliance YouTube channel, and you can stay tuned for more updates on their Facebook page. So we just want to take a moment to thank our partners who made this conference possible. This conference is hosted by Citizens Environmental Alliance and their visionary partners, Quill Lakes Eco Museum, Ducks Canada, the Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, the Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, Nature Saskatchewan, PPPI, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, Sierra Club Canada Foundation, SAWS, and Saskatoon Wildlife Federation. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day. Take care, everyone.
Would you like me to stay on?